Hello and welcome to Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra and these are the key global headlines we are tracking this evening. European Parliament declares Russia to be a state sponsor of terror, says Russia's deliberate attacks on Ukraine is a violation of human rights and international laws. Ukraine President Zelensky urges the United Nations to step in as Russia continues to strike Kyiv's critical infrastructure. Pakistan Prime Minister appoints Lieutenant General Asim Munir as the new army chief. Munir will take over from outgoing General Javed Bajwa, who retires next week. Foxconn apologizes for a technical error during onboarding process after massive protests at its COVID-hit iPhone factory over a pay dispute. The company says actual pay would be the same as agreed. The European Union proposes a price cap on gas prices to stave off an impending energy crisis. Nations like Netherlands and Germany are skeptical about the move. The EU maintains that the proposal is balanced and will help the bloc avoid excessively high prices. Another shooting in the United States. A man suspected to be a Walmart employee opens fire in a Virginia store, kills 6 before shooting himself. The European Parliament has declared Russia as a state sponsor of terror, stating that Russia has violated human rights and the international humanitarian law. President Zelensky welcomed the move and urged the United Nations Security Council to act against Russia. In a video message, the president said, and I quote, "Today is just one day, but we have received 70 missiles. That's the Russian formula of terror." End of quote. Russia has been firing missiles at Ukraine's critical infrastructure like nuclear power plants. The attack on Ukraine's prime power grid left citizens without electricity or water, with Kyiv's mayor saying that nearly 70% of the city is still without any electricity. This has caused a ripple effect across the border, with Moldova losing power across half the country. Anna Chernikova, a reporter from the Voice of America, is joining us live from Kyiv right now. Anna, give us a sense of where you are right now. We have been reading reports of massive power cuts across Ukraine because of the Russian airstrikes that have been happening. What is the current situation?
Hello. Well, I'm standing right next to one of the energy facilities that was almost hit by Russian missile for a couple of times already. I cannot, unfortunately, tell the exact location, but due to security reasons. But what I can say is that yesterday it was another massive attack on the Ukraine, particularly on the Ukrainian energy infrastructure. And today, the city of Kyiv and also other cities across Ukraine are still suffering from lack of energy, electricity, and water supply. It's still a big problem. So now it's still no electricity in many cities in Ukraine for the whole day today. And water supply is also a big problem. However, most of the cities have water supply back. So what I can say is that situation is really difficult. People are really coping as much as they can. They buy generators, they buy alternative sources of energy to be able to stay at least charged and to be able to actually stay in touch with their relatives. So what I can say is that the area
Anna,
where I'm standing right now still has no electricity. So, well, as I already said, for today, almost the whole day, it's no electricity supply at all.
Right. So you're saying that no electricity supply almost for an entire day. So how has the life of an ordinary Ukrainian been impacted? So you're saying the place where you are, you've seen almost a 24-hour power cut. Is this the situation across different parts of Ukraine? Have some parts been without electricity for 2 to 3 days? What about the water situation? What about the road and infrastructure situation?
Well, not 2 to 3 days, not yet at least. So what I can say is that now it's around 12 hours, in some places more, in some places less, but there is no electricity for around half a day now in total, if we count in hours. And unfortunately, similar situation is in very different parts of Ukraine, central part, north, west, south, and east. People are coping. Well, it's difficult. Of course, it's difficult for people. People are trying to cope as much as they can. Some people buy alternative sources of energy, like generators, for instance, to be able to at least charge their phones and to cook some easy stuff and to boil water. And also a lot of businesses, a lot of offices are also providing with generators, providing people spaces to charge and to heat.
One quick question. Does the current situation impact the Ukraine military's ability to hit back at Russia?
No, Ukrainian military continue their operations and continue their actions. It doesn't really, so they have their own separate sources of energy on the front, at the front line. And also for people, President Zelensky confirmed that it is already around 4,000 places, special points where people can come to heat and to charge. These places are around the town, and they have water supply and heat and electricity supply. So in case there is critical situation for a couple of days, people have certain place to go.
Right. Okay, Anna Chernikova, thank you very much for stepping out, giving us a sense of what's happening in Ukraine right now. Stay safe, and thanks once again for joining us with that comprehensive ground report. Let's take this forward with Alexander Kara, diplomat and fellow at the Center of Defense Strategies. Thank you very much for joining us on CNBC TV18. Alexander, let me begin by asking you, we are looking at power cuts, and possibly I get a sense that where you are right now, you're also witnessing a power cut situation. Does this somehow complicate things for Ukraine? And the current round of missile strikes on Ukraine's power infrastructure, energy infrastructure, what do you think is triggering this response from the Russians?
Thank you for having me. And certainly it was not just symbolic that the European Parliament recognized Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, because terrorism is a mean how Russia fighting for wars, not just in Ukraine. We've seen it in Syria, we've seen reports in Mali, in some other African countries. The Russians are savages who disregard international law. And having no ability to beat Ukrainian armed forces on the battleground, they turn to destruction of the civilian infrastructure, trying to break our will, trying to cause a huge outflow of Ukrainian refugees to Europe, undermining European support of Ukraine. But certainly it's failing. Yes, up to 40% of our energy facilities has been struck, and our heroes, I would say, the engineers are trying to restore it. I've been without electricity just for 5 hours. I'm privileged to live in the capital, and I know my parents just in outskirts have been without electricity for 48 hours already. And there are some other places in Ukraine with more, let's say, dire straits than we have. But anyway, it's not going to affect our will to fight back, and we are fighting the right cause, the war for independence of the neo-colonial power who wants to impose its will on us. So we have no choice but to fight back.
Alexander, we're also reading that the last 3 nuclear power stations in Ukraine have been disconnected from the power grid. How could this complicate the energy situation for Ukraine going into winter?
First of all, we should say that Russia is a major nuclear power who is waging war against non-nuclear power, the Ukraine. And then Russia seized. It's just the first in the world case when the country or the state is capturing the nuclear power station. In the beginning, it was Chernobyl power station, defunct Ukrainian nuclear power plant that, infamous in the world because of the disaster. And now Russians are taking hostage of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the biggest in Europe. With these missile attacks, they cut off the supplies of energy from the rest of Ukrainian nuclear power plants, and they just pushed a bit of our infrastructure to the catastrophe. Because, if there is no power supply to the energy units, there would be a possibility of the nuclear disaster. Yes, it's really considerable, and the Russians rely on this harm to push Ukrainian government to accept unacceptable terms of the negotiations with Russia, which is actually laying down our arms and agreeing of being subjected to Russia.
Alexander, do you feel that Ukrainians, it was already speculated that Europe will have a harsh winter, but looking at the kind of power cuts, looking at the water situation, do you think Ukrainians are heading for a very, very difficult time that will test their resolve in this war against Russia?
Well, certainly we are into difficult times this winter, but I don't think that it will change the minds of Ukrainians, and they would press our President Zelensky or our government to agree on the Russian terms, because it's just, no, it's a genocidal war, and the world witnessed Borodyanka and some other places, and recently liberated from Russia. They've been killing innocent people. They are killing just children. Actually, you know, it's really symbolic with this missile attack. They targeted the hospital, the women's hospital near Kiev, and they killed 9, well, actually, just newly born baby. This baby was born after the 9 months of the Russian aggression. So certainly it's going to test our resolve, but for sure Ukrainians are gathering to fight back. And you know, one of the first reactions on any missile attacks, Ukrainians are donating money for weapons for our forces to beat the Russians and to get them out of our land.
All right. Alexander Kara, we've run out of time, but thank you very much for joining us. Despite being in a difficult situation, there are power cuts at the place where you are. Ukrainians are facing water shortages, food shortages. But despite that, the resolve of an ordinary Ukrainian has not been broken. Thank you very much, Alexander, for joining us. Shifting focus now to the measles outbreak that the World Health Organization is worried about. The outbreak has now spread to at least 26 nations, as well as large parts of India. The central government has rushed special teams for 3 states. The other major concern, record high COVID cases in China since the start of the pandemic. I caught up with Dr. Margaret Harris, WHO spokesperson, and I began by asking her about the outbreak of measles and the seriousness of it all.
Our progress towards eliminating measles is really now threatened by major setbacks that started in 2020 during the COVID-19 vaccine pandemic. We're now seeing record lows of under-immunized or not immunized children. Nearly 40 million children now are really, really susceptible to measles outbreaks. So we're in a situation where it's an imminent catastrophe, but one that we can turn around if we take action now.
And is this primarily because over the 2 years of the pandemic, the immunization for measles took a back seat?
Everything really, unfortunately, took a back seat. We've seen that routine immunization of children was severely affected because the world was focusing on COVID. Interestingly, we didn't see large outbreaks of measles when so much of the world was in lockdown. But now we are seeing outbreaks, and now we've got, as I said, huge numbers of very young children who are susceptible. And this is a deadly disease. This is a big killer of young children.
Which are the countries which could be the worst affected, and where you're seeing a big rise in measles cases?
We've seen at least 26 countries reporting outbreaks. Now, one of the biggest problems is surveillance. So while I'm talking about outbreaks, we know that there are many more cases than are actually being reported because, again, countries were so focused on COVID that the testing, the tracking of measles that was going on before hasn't been happening. And now it's critical that countries really step that up to protect our most precious asset, our small children.
Right. What about India? Any outlook on India? What is the situation with measles as far as India goes?
It's an issue for India as well, definitely. Of the 10 countries with the largest number of unimmunized children, India is one of them. Now, of course, India has a huge population, so that's why you have those large numbers. But India also is very good at immunization and very good at public health. So it means that India can turn this around and needs to focus, really be committed to getting that surveillance underway again, getting the immunization happening, really building up the local basic healthcare services and encouraging parents to bring their babies to be vaccinated at the right time.
Any immediate measures that you're recommending to countries, especially India?
To all countries. This applies to all countries. There is not one WHO region that is doing well at the moment. So this is something that we as the world really face. Measles is a highly contagious virus. In fact, before we saw COVID, the Delta and Omicron versions of COVID, it was the most infectious virus on the planet. And one infected person can infect another 20 people around, 18 to 20 people around them. So it spreads like wildfire. So every country, every health service in the world needs to really now step up efforts to track measles and to get all the children immunized.
Right. My final question, Dr. Harris, and this is on COVID. The news coming in from China that with over 30,000 cases, China is seeing a record high in daily cases since the start of the pandemic. How serious is this for the world right now?
Well, this is a warning. COVID certainly hasn't gone. Now, a lot of countries have really stepped up their vaccination, and that is protecting a lot of people. We're seeing fewer people die, but we still are seeing 7,000 to 8,000 people dying every week. And so COVID is not last year's news. It's still very much with us, and we have to take COVID as seriously as the other threats.
Yes, 40 million children facing the risk of measles, and the examples coming from China of record high COVID cases only telling us and warning us that COVID is not over. We need to keep up the immunization program. We're heading into a short break, but coming up on the other side, India and UK are gearing up for the next round of negotiations on the trade deal. But is it really so simple? What are the hurdles? We have a special discussion with Prabhash Ranjan of Jindal Global Law School when we're back. India, UK set to begin the next round of negotiations on the trade deal soon. Both countries have set an internal deadline to control negotiations by March 2023. But there are definitely some hurdles as far as these trade deals go. And UK has made it very clear that they will not compromise on their needs, on their core interests, just because they have to meet any particular deadline. Let me go across to Prabhash Ranjan, an expert on bilateral treaties, also a professor of law at Jindal Global Law School. Professor Ranjan, thank you very much for joining us. Let me begin with issues on tariff rates on key products like automobiles. This is a very core issue for the Indian industry. How do you think negotiations will play out on this front?
Yeah, thank you, Parikshit, for having me on the show. Tariff rates is indeed a very, very important issue, and especially for automobiles, because UK is quite keen to push for a tariff reduction in the automobile sector. Now, one of the challenges that we face is that because of the Make in India campaign, the tariff rates in India across the board have been increasing in the last 3 to 4 years. And because of the increase in these tariff rates, it makes the negotiations difficult. Now, if we take the automobile sector, the tariff rates on cars is in the range of 60% to 100%. Now, this obviously is not something which would be acceptable to the UK, which would like a drastic reduction in the automobile sector on the tariff rates. Automobiles has actually been a success story in India, and therefore, for the automobile sector to resist against any such reduction perhaps sends out a negative signal about how ready the Indian industry is to compete with the imports coming from the UK. So I think that on this stand, unless or until India agrees and reduces the tariff rate, this will be a difficult issue between the two sides.
Right, definitely. This was a problem area during the last EU-India FTA negotiations as well. Also, the point on IPR issues, especially evergreening of patents. There have been reports that this could be a problem, a setback in future for the Indian pharmaceutical industry. Give us a sense of what kind of IPR controls or measures does UK want to put in the trade deal, which may or may not benefit India?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The IP issue is also a very important one. I mean, recently, as you would know, there was a leaked text of the IP chapter, which actually created a lot of ripples. In the leaked IP chapter, the proposition was that UK is pushing for evergreening of patents, which basically means to extend the patent protection beyond the normal 20 years. Plus, they also want India to change their laws and give up on the pre-grant opposition of patents. Uh, it has been clarified subsequently that this is merely a negotiating text, and India is going to resist to these changes. But it's a well-known fact that the developed world has always put pressure on countries like India to adopt a higher IP standard. And therefore, I'm not surprised to see that this is part of the negotiations. India needs to be very, very clear on this, and India should ensure that it does not accept any IP provision in the FTA which is TRIPS plus in its nature. So the Indian patent laws are compatible with India's WTO obligations, and India should insist on maintaining that even within the FTA. Otherwise, the access to medicines and the pharmaceutical industry in India, especially the generic sector, is definitely going to take a hit.
All right, linking trade with labor and environment issues, how difficult will this aspect of the negotiation be?
This is going to be a very difficult aspect, Parikshit, because UK hasn't signed any FTA which doesn't have a linkage with labor and environment. India's traditional position has always been that labor and environment should be outside the ambit of a trade agreement. Now, what we hear is that there might be a compromise reached in the sense that India might accept these provisions as a best endeavor clause or a best endeavor chapter, which means India will not accept these as binding commitments. Now, whether UK will accept something like that or not is something to be seen, because, as I said, so far UK wants the other side to have binding commitments on issues like labor and environment, which India is clearly against.
Right. When it comes to mobility, yes, India has been wanting greater mobility of professionals, greater mobility of students to the UK, higher number of visas. Will this happen automatically due to negotiations at the highest political level? Because there is a pushback and there is a demand for limits to the migration from India as well.
Yeah, I think one of the most important offensive interests that India has in all the FTA negotiations, not just with the UK, but also with the EU, is trade and services, because that is a major area in which India has a comparative advantage. Now, India needs to push for liberalizing the UK labor market so that more and more professionals from India can go and work in the UK. Unless or until there is a favorable outcome on trade and services, it will be very difficult for India to kind of derive the benefits that one expects from the India-UK FTA. There is going to be resistance in the UK for this. But we do hope that there will be some give and take and some compromise would be reached on this issue.
All right, Mr. Ranjan, we've completely run out of time, but one quick question. Investment protection. The UK ambassador had also said that they won't want investment protection for UK companies investing in India. Will the Indian side be able to accept this?
Well, in my view, India should accept it. This is a reasonable demand that the UK has been making. Investment is very much a part of the FTA. You can't have a comprehensive economic trade agreement or a economic agreement without investment chapter being a part of it. But on this, India's stand is not very clear. If we look at India's FTAs with Mauritius, UAE, Australia, they do not contain any investment protection features. And India hasn't come out very clearly what its stand on this issue is. Maybe India prefers to negotiate investment treaties separately from the FTA. But in my view, this does not make economic and legal sense. And therefore, UK insisting on this is quite reasonable. In fact, it's good for India as well, because you have a lot of Indian investment in the UK, and that investment also requires protection under international law. So investment chapter would be a win-win situation.
All right.
In my view, for both the sides.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Ranjan, for joining us here on Global Eye, giving your view on the key issues that would crop up in the negotiations. And as the UK ambassador told us, the core part of negotiations on goods, services and investment protection will begin now. With that, it's a wrap. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.